In a previous blog post that I will link to in the description of this video, we created a chatbot, and we created that chatbot using an Azure static website as the client for the chatbot. We used Lewis to determine the user's intent so that we could determine what are they asking. We used a SharePoint list to return the content of that intent, so now that users could maintain responses within SharePoint and not have to go to any other tool to do so. And then we used a logic app so that we could query that SharePoint list for the intent and display it to the user. So in the end, we had deployed a simple QnA chatbot to Microsoft Teams where you could interact with that bot, and it returns information from SharePoint based upon the user's intent. So after I went through and created all of this, it struck me that we could remove and refine this a little bit, and we could implement this same chatbot using PowerApps and Flow. So we can remove the need for the Azure static website. We can remove the need for the logic app and use Flow instead. And then we can stick that within a Power App, and we also get a little bit of extra added security by doing it within PowerApps as well. So let's go through and I'll show you guys how easy it was to get that same functionality working within PowerApps. So actually we're going to start building this bot in Flow because Flow does most of the work, and then we simply have to wire up the flow to PowerApps. So let's go into Flow, and we're going to create a new flow. We'll go ahead and create from blank. And then for our triggers, we want to look for a PowerApps trigger. So we have PowerApps as our trigger, and we want to add a new step. So the way this flow is going to work is it's going to be triggered from PowerApps, and a user is going to ask a question, and we need to pass that question to Lewis. So the next thing we need to do is we need to add an action to send it to Lewis, and there are actually actions in here already for Lewis. Here's one called Get Prediction. It's in preview, but let's go ahead and use that for our instances here. And then when you look at this action, it's needing a few things. It's needing the ID for your Lewis app. So if we go into Lewis and you click on Manage up here at the top, you go into your application information, and within the application information you have an application ID. So we can copy this application ID, take it into Flow, and we can paste in that value there. The next thing it's asking for is the utterance text, saying, what question are we passing to Lewis to get the intent? And that's actually coming from PowerApps. So let's click in this text box, and if we look at our dynamic content, you see we have a section here for PowerApps. And if you click on See More, there is a selection for Ask in PowerApps. That means this information, this question, is going to come from PowerApps. Now we can also specify the desired intent. To be safe, let's just go ahead and put in none as our desired intent. And we now have the functionality written to get an intent from a user when they ask a question in PowerApps. The next step in the process, though, is to take that intent and query our SharePoint list by that intent to get the correct response. If you remember, one more time, if we go back into Lewis, we looked at we have 3 intents listed: greeting, none, and who should attend. And then in our SharePoint list called FAQ, we have a list where the title field is the same as the intent that exists in Lewis. And the response that we want to send the user is in a field called FAQ in that FAQ list. Okay? Since it's stored in a list, this means that almost anybody can easily maintain the responses that you want to give within your chatbot. So let's go back to Flow, and so our next step is going to be to query SharePoint. So let's do a search for SharePoint get items. And we are going to choose our list that has our site that has the list. We're going to choose the list FAQ. Then we need to do a filter query. And again, we need to query where the title field is equal to the intent. So we can say filter where the title is equal to, if we go down to our dynamic content, we have one for top scoring intent name. So this is the top scoring intent name that comes from Lewis. So let's filter that list by it, and we want to return the top one count because there should always only be one entry. The next thing we need to do is we need to create a variable to store this response in so that we can pass that variable back to PowerApps. So let's create a new action to initialize a variable. And we will create a variable called response that is a string. Now we need to add a new step to set that variable, and we can't set the variable when we initialize it because a collection is coming back from that getItems query. So we actually have to set the variable in a separate step. So let's do set variable, and we will set the variable response to the value that comes back from our query of FAQ, which is the name of the field that holds the response. And you can see that Flow automatically puts that in and apply to each because Flow doesn't know how many items are going to return from that. But we now have our response stored into a variable called response, and it's simply time to pass that variable back to PowerApps. So I'll add one final step. It is going to be a PowerApps step. So let's search for PowerApps. And that's going to be respond to PowerApps. And we are going to respond with text. We will respond in a response with a name of response, and the value will be our variable response. Okay, and that's all there is to it. So we get the question from PowerApps. We pass the question to Lewis to get the intent. We query our SharePoint list by that intent to get the response. We store the response in a variable, and then we return that variable from our flow. So all we have to do now is save, and we can get to work. So now we have a new flow. Let's go ahead and rename our flow here so it makes more sense. We'll call it the Hillbilly Chat Flow. It'll be easier to find in PowerApps that way. So now let's save that. And now it's time to go build our form in PowerApps. So here we are in PowerApps, and let's go ahead and create a new app that is a blank app. And let's go ahead and choose a phone layout. Why not? This way it looks good on mobile. So we've got our blank app here, and to this app we want to add the pieces we need to finish out our chatbot. So I'm going to insert a text box, and this is going to be the text box that people use to enter their question. We will give this a default of what you need. And then we also need to add a submit button, because this is the button that users are going to use to submit their question. And we'll give it the text of submit. And then we need to display the response to the user. So let's add an HTML text to the screen, and we will add that to display the response. Okay? So we have all the pieces we should need to display the response from our flow. So what I need to do now is select the submit button, go to the actions here, and select flows. When I select flows, we see our flow that we previously created called Hillbilly Chat Flow. So we're going to select that, and it's going to add that. And you'll notice when we add it, it knows that it needs information from PowerApps because we told it we're going to be passing in information, the question. So we need to finish the creation of this function here, and we're going to be passing to the run function the value that the user enters in the text box. So that's going to be text input 1 dot text. Okay? So now we are calling the flow and we're passing in the question. The thing is, when that response comes back from the flow, it's actually coming back as a collection. So we can't just set the response to a variable and then display that variable. We actually have to do a couple more steps there. So what we need to do is we need to, when the flow is done, we need to call a function called clear collect, And what that does is it clears a variable that's a collection and then sets that collection variable to the results. And since the result of this flow is considered a collection, we can store the response that we get back from that flow into a variable that we're calling response in a collection. Okay? So we're going to call the flow, passing in that question. The response is going to come back, and we're going to store that response in a variable collection. Now, since we are storing this response in a collection, we have to actually have a way of displaying that data now. It's no longer just a variable. So to do that, we need to insert a data table. And this data table is going to actually, the data source for this data variable is going to be our response variable. So I'm going to tell it, I'm going to select it, and then I'm going to say that, and here in the formula, that the data for it is going to be in the response variable. Okay? So we now have the response being, now we have the data table set up to have the data as the response, which is a collection. The next thing we need to do is we need to tell it what data from that collection do we want to display into our data table. So if we click on this link here, it's smart enough to know that there is a field called response, and we're going to add response as what we're going to display. Okay? You guys follow me so far? So what we had to do, I'll keep reiterating it so it makes sense to me too. User enters a question in the text box. We hit the submit button. The submit button calls a flow where we pass in the value of that text box. Then it returns the response into a collection variable called response. And we are going to say the data source for this data table is that collection that comes back from the flow. The last thing we need to do is we need to now display that response into our HTML text field. We can't just display the response. We could display the response in the data table, but it's not going to be formatted with HTML. It would just be unformatted. In fact, let me show you guys what that looks like. So let's go ahead and run this now. And I can type in something to our text box here. I can say hello and submit that. And you can see it came back in this data table, but it's HTML formatted, so we can't really make sense of it. So what we need to do is we need to specify that the source for our HTML text box is going to be the data table dot selected. There's only going to be one row, so it's going to be the selected row, and is going to be the response field from that selected row. And then we are going to come in here and we're going to hide the data table so the users do not see it. Okay? So one more time, person asks a question gets passed to the flow, the response gets stored in the collection gets tied to the data table, and then we take the selected entry from the data table and display it into our HTML text box so we can display it in a formatted manner. Clear as mud? Sound good? Now let's run our Power App. So now if I type in a question, let's see, the other questions we can do is who should attend? If you remember from the very first video we set this up, or second or third, I copied some information from the Ignite website about their FAQ about who should attend Ignite. So I should be able to come over to our app and say who should attend. Submit that. And there's our response. A little bit small text. We need to format that to be a little better to read, but there's our response from our SharePoint list. I can also say hello and submit that. And there's our response from our SharePoint list for the response. How about, let's say something nonsense so we can get the none response. I can say, I like bacon. We submit that. And the response is, what in tarnation are you talking about? Okay? So that's pretty much all there is to it. We now have this QnA bot that works as a Power App. Deploy the Power App wherever you want to. We are calling Flow behind the scenes to do all the work. So it's taking care of all our connections for us. Pretty painless to do, pretty cool. You may have some scenarios for it, but take it, run with it. Hope you guys learned something. Again, I did, so that's all that counts, right? Thanks, bye.